Everywhere Jesus went, people gathered. You can imagine that the same thing would happen today if someone were walking and could do what Jesus did, could teach the way Jesus taught, then people would flock to where that person was. The word started with people who had watched it, and then it spread as they began to tell more and more people. Now, I know that you don't have anyone in your church who gossips, but maybe you know someone who does. Maybe you know someone who feels it is his responsibility or her responsibility not only to know the latest news about everyone, but to make sure that others know the latest news about everyone. And so the word begins small, but it begins to spread outward. For example, the word begins with, oh, he bought a new truck. 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 They got engaged. They got engaged. They got engaged. They got engaged. She's gaining weight. She's gaining weight. She's gaining weight. She's gaining weight. And the word just spreads as one person begins to say it to another. Well, the same thing happened back in Jesus' day without social media, without any sort of electronic connections at all. People saw Jesus, they heard Jesus, and began telling everyone that they knew about this new mysterious man. And so everywhere Jesus went, people gathered. But just because Jesus regularly had large crowds around him did not mean that everyone within those crowds was committed to Jesus. That's the occasion where we find ourselves reading today from Matthew chapter 13. Would you open your Bibles there, please, to this parable that Jesus told? It's one of Jesus' most famous parables, and it's one of the very few that he explained. Often we are left to our scholars and research and interpretation guided by the Holy Spirit to know what Jesus meant, but this parable he explains specifically. And over the next hour and a half or so, there are some things that I would like to bring from this. What? In Matthew chapter 13, beginning in the 3rd verse, actually we'll back up to the first to give you a little bit of context here. On that day, Jesus went out of the house and was sitting by the sea. Such large crowds gathered around him that he got into a boat and sat down while the whole crowd stood on the shore. Now, you can understand why Jesus would do this. If he were standing on the bank and people began to press closer and closer and closer, he would have a difficult time projecting his voice to the people on the back rows where the riffraff are, without shouting at the people on the front rows. And so he got into a boat to give himself a little bit of distance between the people so that he could get his voice out to the people in the back. Then beginning in verse 3, the Bible says, "Then he told them many things in parables, saying, 'Consider the sower who went out to sow. As he sowed, some seed fell along the path, and the birds came and devoured them. Other seed fell on rocky ground where it didn't have much soil, and it grew up quickly since the soil wasn't deep. But when the sun came up, it was scorched, and since it had no root, it withered away. Other seed fell among thorns, and the thorns came up and choked it. Still other seed fell on good ground and produced fruit, some 100, some 60, and some 30 times what was sown. Let anyone who has ears listen.'" Then later, as I told you, Jesus explained the parable. Beginning in verse 18, Jesus said, "So listen to the parable of the sower. When anyone hears the word about the kingdom and doesn't understand it, the evil one comes and snatches away what was sown in his heart. This is the one sown along the path. And the one sown on rocky ground. This is the one who hears the word and immediately receives it with joy. But he has no root and is short-lived. When distress or persecution comes because of the word, immediately he falls away. Now the one sown among the thorns, this is the one who hears the word, but the worries of this age and the deceitfulness of wealth choke the word, and it becomes unfruitful. But the one sown on the good ground, This is the one who hears and understands the word, who produces fruit and yields some 100, some 60, and some 30 times what was sown. Jesus addressed people in the crowd through this parable. And with his intuition, with his discernment, he was able to look out at the crowd of people and say, I am speaking to the 4 types of people in this parable today. And even though calendar pages have changed and times are different, people are the same. And the same types of people who listened to Jesus teach this parable are the same types of people that are gathered in this room this morning. What did Jesus say? Well, Jesus said the farmer went out to sow his seed, and some of the seed fell on hard ground. Back in Bible times, most of the agriculture was done for families. They weren't necessarily growing crops for mass production. They were growing for their families. And so instead of having acres and acres and acres and acres of just one crop, the farmers would divide their land into several sections so that they could grow corn, beans, wheat, whatever. Similar to the way that the sections in the auditorium are. And so Jesus said the farmer went out to sow his seed, and in between those sections were little pathways like the aisles. These pathways never were plowed, never were watered, because the farmer wanted to be able to use them to get in between his sections. We in Mississippi have something similar: red clay. Those of you who are moms or do laundry know that red clay will be always at the top of the socks or at the top of the shoe line on socks, no matter how often you try to wash them. If your sons or daughters' baseball or softball uniforms are white pants, there's always just a little trace of orange right back here where they slide, because that red clay is indestructible. You cannot get rid of it. After the nuclear holocaust happens, there are only going to be 3 things left: cockroaches, that red clay, and Taylor Swift. That's all that's going to be able to survive. And so Jesus said the farmer sowed some of his seed, but as he did so, some of the seed maybe fell over the lips of the bag or through his fingers, and it landed on these pathways. Well, because the ground was just like concrete, the seed had nowhere to go. And birds came and ate it up. Jesus said there are some people just like that. There are some people who already have made up their minds before they even hear the word. I choose to reject it. They do not understand its truth. They do not understand its life-transforming power. And so, since the hearts are as hard as concrete, the birds of the air come and take the seed away, and it produces nothing. When Jesus told this story, he wasn't talking about dirt. He was talking about people. He's talking about us. Now you may be saying, well, now wait a minute, Gary. I am here in church on Sunday morning. Obviously, I am not shaking my fist in God's face, rebelling against him. And to some degree, I might say, yes, that possibly is the case. But I think each one of us have areas in our lives where we are determined to do what we want instead of what God wants. And as he continues working, trying to penetrate those areas, we already have made up our minds to say, no, now God, you can have other areas, but this area belongs to me. Jesus said there was a second type of soil. He said the farmer went out to sow his seed, and as he reached into his bag and scattered seed out into the ground, there in verse 5, other seed fell on rocky ground where it didn't have much soil, and it grew up quickly since the soil wasn't deep. But when the sun came up, it was scorched, and since it had no root, it withered away. Jesus said the farmer threw his seed out into some soil, and when the seed found ground, at first it looked like this seed would be the most prosperous, would be the most fruitful, because it sprang up quickly and grew taller than all of the other plants. But the reason that the plant sprung up quickly and grew taller than all of the others is because it had no room to grow down beneath the soil. And so as the water began to fall on the seed and it began to draw nutrients from the soil, it burst forth and began to try to put down roots. But since there was a layer of bedrock or a stone beneath there, the seed couldn't grow downward, and so it began to shoot upward. And the farmer went out to inspect it. Oh, look at little buddy. He's growing. Going to get a lot from this one. But when the Middle Eastern sun grew hot, the plant was starving for nutrients and water from the soil. It could not draw them because the roots were shallow, and the plant withered away. Jesus said there are some hearts like that. Plenty of us have gone through periods of enthusiasm. We've had bursts of energy. And we have promised God, I'm going to be different this time. When I say that I'm going to read my Bible consistently, I really am going to do it. When I say that I'm going to be more faithful in church attendance, I really mean it, God. And we go through periods where we are different for a couple of weeks or so. And then when the enthusiasm dies down and the newness wears off, we settle right back into the places where we were. We burst up tall, and others in church began to notice, oh, look at the change. But because we did not take the time to put down roots, that new enthusiasm and burst of energy withered away. I have a friend who's a pastor in Mississippi. He and his wife, late one fall, decided together that instead of buying each other Christmas presents, they would buy some home exercise equipment. They began thinking, we're getting a little out of shape and we don't really want to go to the gym, and so let's purchase some home exercise equipment in order to take better care of ourselves physically. And so they did a massive amount of research by watching infomercials to see all of the different types of home exercise equipment. And so they would see this one little piece and say, oh, maybe we should do that. Oh, maybe we should do that. All of this looks so easy. It just looks like we can just, continue eating our potato chips and everything's just going to work perfectly. They decided to purchase the Total Gym. Does anyone know who the spokesperson for the Total Gym is? Does anyone know? Chuck Norris. And so my friend Alan said he wanted his body to look like Chuck Norris's. At that time, his body looked like Chuck E. Cheese's. And so he said, I'm going to really get into shape. And so he and his wife did not buy any other presents for each other. They simply purchased the Total Gym and really began exercising, working out. We're invigorated, we're living, we're alive. They would get up early every morning and do the Total Gym. But one day, I don't know whether they had not slept well the night before or maybe just had not even collapsed into the bed early enough. But when the alarm sounded at 5 o'clock, they rubbed their eyes. Oh, are you as tired as I am? Yes. Let's just don't do the Total Gym. Let's do it when we get home from work. Okay. And so they went to work that day. They came in from work and said, no, look, we're not going to skip today. Let's do the total gym. And so they got into some exercise clothes and began exercising. They said, why are we getting up early every day? This is when we need to do the total gym. We come home from work tired and exhausted, and so we get a new boost of energy. So let's start doing the total gym right when we first come home from work. And so that's what they began to do. Until one day. One day they rushed in and had to scarf down some supper quickly because their two boys had baseball games. And so they said, we don't have time to do the total gym now, but we are going to do it before we go to bed tonight. And so no matter how late this baseball game goes, we are going to do the total gym. And so when they came in from baseball, they started exercising, took showers and said, why are we killing ourselves at 5 o'clock to do this exercise? We always have some sort of evening activity. This time is when we should do the total gym. We can exercise, we'll be exhausted when we go to bed, we'll take a shower, and we will sleep like babies. And so they began doing the total gym right before they would go to bed. Until one night. One night they came in and neither had any energy, and they said, let's just skip the total gym this one night. I saw Alan about the middle of March of the next year. And I asked him how his exercise program was going. He said, well, you know, that machine's a lot harder than it looks on TV. I said, really? That's astonishing. And he said, we just don't, it's just not going as well as we had hoped. And so I asked him if he were going to sell the total gym or donate it. He said, no, we use it every day. We sit on it to put on our shoes, or we hang shirts on it. But their enthusiasm for exercising was gone. When Jesus told this story, he wasn't talking about dirt. He was talking about people. He's talking about us. Many of us, including myself, have heard the Spirit of God speaking to us about steps that He wanted us to take, new chapters that He wanted to write, and we began them with energy and enthusiasm, but we did not develop the discipline of putting down roots through meaningful time with Him in prayer and communion in the Scriptures. And as a result, once the newness wore off of our new decision, we settled right back into the places where we were. Jesus said the farmer went out to sow his seed. Some of the seed fell along the pathways in between the sections of the field. Some of the seed went into soil that was good on top, but it was very shallow. But then he said some of the seed fell in verse 7, other seed fell among thorns, and the thorns came up and choked it. Jesus said the farmer threw some seed out into the ground, and when the seed went into the ground, there were no stones, there was no bedrock underneath, and so the roots began growing deeply. And as those roots began growing, they began soaking up water and minerals from the soil. But also, in the same patch of ground were thorns and weeds. And as the seed began trying to draw water, minerals from the soil, so did all of the weeds. They began drawing water. They began drawing minerals and nutrients from the soil. And as they grew bigger, the soil could not sustain both. The soil did not have enough water and nutrients for both the good seed and the weeds. And as they typically do when they are not cleaned away, the weeds won. And they choked the life out of the good seed. Jesus said there are some hearts like that. There are some people who do want to maintain a level of devotion to God. They enjoy the company of God's people. They certainly want the rewards that come from being one of Christ's followers. But at the same time, they are determined to hold on to agendas and priorities that not only are not compatible with God's kingdom, but are on collision courses with it. Somehow they rationalize, they justify, they might admit, well, I know I'm making a compromise in this area, but I'm going to be able to find a way to sort it all out. But when weeds and good seed live together, the weeds always win. I went to high school not far from you in West Point. And one of my best friends in high school was a girl named Carla O'Brien. Carla and I grew up right down the street from each other. And so during our younger days, we buddied around with all of the rest of our friends. And at that time, Carla was very much a tomboy. And so she would play football with us, ride bicycles with us. And somehow we just had a good bond. We had a good connection, which worked out terrifically for me later. Because as Carla grew older, the tomboy disappeared. And she was stunningly beautiful. And so, if we had some place to go and needed a date, but did not have a date, we always would just go with each other. And so when Carla would walk into the room, people would. And they would see me with her go. I said, that's right, we're together. Well, my junior year in high school, Carla's sophomore year, 2 senior boys were hot on her trail. They both wanted her to be their girlfriend. And so they went back and forth, trying to get her attention. Both of these boys played football for the Green Wave. Carla cheered for the Green Wave. One played offense, one played defense. And when the offense was on the field, this one, I can't say their names because they all still live in West Point. And so when one of the boys was on the field playing defense, the boy playing offense would slide his way down, still keeping his eye to but he would try to talk to Carla, cheering on the sideline. And then it was time for him to put his helmet on, run out. The other player would run out. He would make his way back here. Now, I know that most of the teenage boys and college boys will be in the second service. But I want to give a word of counsel to all adolescent boys in this room. When a teenage girl knows that 2 boys are after her, she becomes evil. And Carla would come to school on Monday talking about what a wonderful time she had with one of the boys over the weekend. We went to Harvey's, or we went to this. And so then the other boy would say, man, I was going to take her to Sonic. That's not going to work. And so they would go back and forth, just falling all over themselves to get her attention. One day in the cafeteria, however, as we were sitting there at our table, these 2 boys walked up and sat down. They looked straight at Carla and said, you have to choose. We cannot keep doing this. You can pick me, you can pick him, but you have to choose. And the reason is because they knew that the place that they wanted in her heart only had room for one. And what's sad about all of this is that Carla never was interested in either one of them. She was after me. She never really cared about either one of those boys. In fact, she did choose. She said neither. They were left out in the cold. When Jesus told this story, he was not talking about dirt. Jesus was talking about people. He was talking about us. He said there are plenty of people who regularly sit in church pews, and by no means do they want to push Jesus out of their lives. But by no means do they want to give up what is competing with him either. And Jesus said that approach won't ever work. Well, up until now, the parable has been pretty discouraging, hasn't it? Because the seed has gone out 3 different times, and each of those times it was not as fruitful as it could have been. But then Jesus came to the concluding part of the story in verse 8. Still other seed fell on good ground and produced fruit, some 100, some 60, and some 30 times what was sown. Jesus looked at those disciples and said, men, do not give up. I'm not saying that this process will happen in the majority of people, but I am saying when you go out to preach the message, when people hear the good news of Jesus Christ and when they internalize it, that there are some people who surrender to him wholeheartedly. They embrace the love that God has shed abroad in their hearts. They want to respond to him in devotion and adoration. And as a result of that, they give God free access to every area of their lives. And when God is able to do what he intends and desires to do, great impact comes. Jesus said, when this seed falls in good soil, it begins bursting forth. And some of the harvests are even 100 times what was sown, some 60, some 30, but all abundant. Jesus said there are some hearts like that. There are some people, though they well know their imperfections, flaws, sins, and weaknesses, who with all sincerity in their hearts say, God, please, accomplish your purposes in me. God, I know that I have so many areas of fault, but as only you can, God, would you please restore what is broken? Would you fill what is empty? God, whatever you ask me, I will do it. Wherever you send me, I will go. Wherever you lead me, I will follow. When Jesus told this story, he wasn't talking about dirt. He was talking about people. He's talking about us. He's showing us what our lives can become through surrendering to him. Everywhere Jesus went, crowds gathered to him. But just because a lot of people were around Jesus did not mean that everyone in those crowds was committed to him. The same idea is true this morning. Even though there are many people in this building, the number doesn't necessarily mean that everyone in the building is in right relationship with God. And so we want to give you an opportunity to respond to anything that God may have said to you this morning. Tom's going to come to the piano and he's going to lead us in a closing song of commitment. And I want to suggest to you several possible ways that you might respond to what God has said this morning. First, I don't want to assume that everyone in the building today already is a follower of Jesus Christ. This Jesus who told this parable went on to accomplish everything that his Father had sent him to do. And at the completion of his mission, Jesus willingly laid down his life not because he was guilty of any crimes, but voluntarily taking upon himself all of our sin and suffering the full wrath of God poured out upon all of the sins of all of the ages. And then on the very first Easter Sunday morning, Jesus rose victoriously, and he is giving new life to people. Last night I spoke at a youth rally in Sturgis, and a young girl about the 11th grade said yes to Jesus. She's part of our family now. And so if there's anyone here this morning who is not a follower of Jesus Christ, in just a moment when we begin singing together, I'm going to ask you to slip out from wherever you may be. Some ministers are going to be here at the front. You just find the one that you feel the most comfortable talking with and say, I have some questions about how to begin a relationship with God. Maybe this morning you saw yourself in this parable. Maybe you are one who has an area or two roped off in your life, and you are just like the hard pathways, and God's been trying to get you for years to let go of that grudge, to forgive that hurt, to be more generous with your money, but you have simply said no. Maybe you're a person whose spiritual pattern has been burst of enthusiasm and then settling right back down, and you're looking for a way to be more consistent. Maybe right now you are struggling with values that not only are not compatible with the kingdom of Jesus, but are in direct contradiction and on a collision course with them. And you want some help in figuring out how to remove those weeds. Maybe your prayer is just, God, please make me fruitful. Make the harvest of my life be 160, 30 times. God, just use me and I'll follow you.